to Life's Journey with Dr. Ralph Smith. I'm Dr. Ralph Smith, of course. Folks, we deal with a lot of problems in our lives, and one of the purposes of Life Journey is to talk about these kind of problems and challenges and come up with solutions. And that's the real purpose of this program. We're going to cover a lot of subjects. And for our very first show, one of the most important subjects that we find that we need to deal with at Jenny Marie Wellness Centers, and we deal with as society, is the unfortunate part of our life, which is domestic violence. I have personally been involved in interventions on domestic violence. I've seen kids harmed by it. I've seen women abused in ways that I wouldn't even want to discuss on this show. It's something that affects us in society across all economic brackets, all different reasons, whether it be drug abuse, lack of a job. It is a very, very serious problem, and we need to address it. So in this program, our very first, we're going to talk about domestic violence. Who better than dealing with law enforcement? And Detective Brian is joining us in this next segment, and he's going to give you the perspective of what it's like on the streets. So you don't have to count on me being a doctor explaining it. We're dealing with a guy that literally has to deal with it day by day. So stay tuned. We'll get into that interview, and then at the very end of this program, we're going to talk about solutions on if you're a victim of domestic violence or if you're a person who is a perpetrator of domestic violence, where you can reach out for help. We'll be right back. You know, in the years that I've been practicing, which has been over 28 years, I have come across what I refer to as the demon. The demons consist of mainly two things. One is substance abuse, and that's all type of substance abuse, and the second is domestic violence. This is a situation that is, quite frankly, out of control, and law enforcement agencies are faced with that each and every day. An ironic twist to domestic violence, which we'll focus on today, is the issue that the largest day, and this is nationwide, the largest day, which means the most episodes of domestic violence, occurs on Super Bowl Sunday. And you might ask yourself, well, why would Super Bowl Sunday be the worst day for domestic violence if you look at it nationwide? And of course, some people who tend to find this subject humorous would turn around and say, well, it's because somebody stepped in front of the television set. Well, it has nothing to do with that, especially the big screens of today. What it has a lot to do is consumption of a lot of alcohol, people around that perhaps you're not familiar being with to watch the game, and of course your team's losing. That's the extra kicker. But what we want to do is we want to talk briefly with Detective Brian and have the detective explain to us a little bit about his history and how we handle these type of episodes of domestic violence. Because unfortunately, a lot of folks watch Cops or they watch some other type of show that involves police work and they think, well, that's the way it is every day. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. But here in Clallam County, which is our focus county today, we want to find out exactly how it works. So, Detective, you'd be kind enough to kind of talk a little bit about your background to folks?
Yes, Dr. Smith. Well, thank you for having me here. I'm Detective Brian Knutson with the Clallam County Sheriff's Office. I've been working for the Sheriff's Office for a little over 11 years now. I'm currently assigned to the Detective Bureau. And during my time on patrol, which was about 9 years on patrol, I did respond to and investigate several incidents of domestic violence.
Detective, when you work on these issues, when you roll up, I'm told by family members who are in law enforcement that call is one of the most dangerous calls to make. You know, and so when you roll up to a scene, kind of walk us through how you manage that based on what you find, because I know a lot of folks that just that have gotten out of law enforcement say that when they hear the thought or they hear the call and the codes you guys use for domestic violence, they really get really nervous about it because it's a very dangerous call. Right. So why don't you give us a typical example perhaps of what you roll up to in a situation like that?
Yes, it is. They are inherently dangerous calls to respond to. So a lot of times what we do is we park about a half a block or a block away from the house that we're about to go make contact at. And we'll walk up to the residence, and as we're approaching the residence, we listen for any signs of disturbance and possibly capture some conversation, whether it be yelling, screaming, or even just a low-level conversation, just to kind of get a sense as to what we're about to approach. Then we, determine what is the best way to, usually it's the front door, but we don't stand what we call the fatal funnel, because we don't know, I think domestic violence calls it, the reason why they are so inherently dangerous is because of the emotion that's wrapped up in the conflict. So we don't know where they're at mentally, where they're at in their life, whether they're desperate, whether there's alcohol or drugs involved with this. Sometimes the dispatchers will give us that information if they're able to get it from the 911 caller. So we will knock on the door, and whoever comes out, we talk to them. We do our best to separate the parties. So, for instance, if it was a husband and wife, typical, or a boyfriend girlfriend, we would separate them, and we roll at least 2 to a domestic violence call, and so we'd separate them, have them at a eye shot, ear shot, and interview them and try and figure out what happened. Meanwhile, keeping an eye of our surroundings, maybe things that we are observing in the house, whether that be items scattered about or what have you, to help us come to a determination as to what exactly happened.
When you roll up upon a scene like that and you knock on the door, and it kind of reminds you of episodes of Blue Bloods, when they knock on the door, they don't still stand in front of the door, they get on the side of the door. Do you ask the question, do you have weapons in the home, or do you assume there could be weapons there no matter what they say?
Well, I'll speak to my personal mentality and just in the culture of law enforcement. Every situation that we approach is an armed situation because we are bringing a firearm into the battle. So it's as long as if you keep that mindset, you're always staying safe. Or but the dispatchers do a good job of extracting that information if possible, from the 911 caller.
Okay. If the dispatcher is doing the proper job, I assume they would ask questions like if you're okay, are there children in the home, and all those type of things. If you roll up upon a scene where there's, it's obvious through the maybe injuries you notice on both of the people that there's absolutely some domestic violence involved, to say the least, what do you do if you find children in the home? How do you handle the children part?
Right. That can be, it's a dynamic situation. It's difficult to figure out sometimes. However, what we do is, and this is after we've executed an arrest, and what we do is we find out if there are any, typically there's one party that stays behind. For instance, if the wife was the victim of the domestic violence assault, and we arrested the husband, transported him to jail, then the kids would be with the victim.
Okay.
They would stay with the victim. However, there are follow-up procedures that we do, which entails us, when we document the incident in report fashion, then we forward a copy to Child Protective Services so that they're aware of the situation. But however, in a situation where we don't feel like the environment is good for the children to stay, despite us making an arrest of one party, and there's alcohol involved, we'll recommend, hey, are there any other family members nearby that we can contact to come take the children, and those sorts of things.
In one particular episode that I had to deal with, and it was an episode, it was almost like a play on television per se, there was a couple involved, I won't mention their names, both patients of mine, and the police department obviously knew there was a history of domestic violence there, so they called me so that I could act as, in a sense, a mediator once the parties were separated. In this particular case, literally when we rolled up, both parties would not let the law enforcement officers into the building, and there was kids there too. So what do you, I wouldn't necessarily call it a hostage situation, but what do you do if they refuse, either both parties or one of the parties, entry for you as an officer of the law? How do you handle that?
Well, if there's a 911 call, I just want to make sure I understood.
Mm-hmm.
There is an initial 911 call,
Yes,
but when
absolutely.
we arrive, we're not getting any cooperation at the door. Is that
Yes,
what you're saying?
exactly.
So if it's obvious in the call that there is a disturbance in the background, our job is to make sure it's safe. So we will go in there, and it's what we call a protective sweep. It is I'm trying to think of the phrase, in good faith, I should say. And we're doing in a good faith effort to make sure that everyone is safe. So we've already been called. 911 has been dispatched. We've showed up. Now, if we show up and we still hear signs of disturbance, absolutely, we're going to go in there. We don't need anybody to let us in. We're going to make sure that everybody is safe. Once we do that final protective sweep, then we'll separate and we'll carry on just like any normal domestic violence situation.
It's an unfortunate part, in a sense, of law enforcement, but it's the loss of officers. And Clallam County has lost sheriff deputies. And in the back of your mind, you have to have that in the back of your mind, not of fear, but in the back of your mind, what am I going to do if I come through the door and I'm confronted with someone with a gun? And in this case I was sharing with you, he was sitting in a rocking chair with a shotgun, just waiting to have come through the door.
Right.
And so I talked to him, and basically from behind the officers, of course, and his wife did open the door, and he was sitting there with a rocking chair with a 12-gauge shotgun aimed right straight at the door.
Wow.
When you run into those type of situations, hopefully it's not often, and also thinking about the loss that we've had previously of Clallam County Sheriff deputies, what do you do then?
If we have information that there's someone with a firearm and they have it in their hands or they have used it already, we are going to approach that scene very cautiously. We're not going to just rush into a scene like that. That's a very difficult situation right there, and it would probably be considered like a barricaded subject, and we would be looking at calling a negotiator in and essentially holding down a perimeter and attempting to gain cooperation before we enter the premises.
Is there any different approach, Brian, on a domestic violence occurrence that is in the daytime or nighttime? Is
No.
the procedure still the same? Even though at night, it's got to be a heck of a lot harder to try to take control of the situation. With dark
Not
being on.
necessarily.
Really?
No, it's the same anyway. But of course, it's more difficult at night just because it's darker and you have to use your flashlight. So you're, if anybody's looking for you, they're going to find you easily, with the flashlight. Whereas at daytime, but it's the same. Procedurally, it's the same.
Well, let's back away from the episode itself and deal briefly with kind of the warning signs up front, and then we'll take a short break and talk about the aftermath. Warning signs up front. If you had a warning sign of, say for example, that a 11-year-old child went to his counselor and said, my daddy beats my mommy up all the time. I know they would probably call Child Protective Services first, but have you been drawn into that situation, especially being a detective, where you try to do something on the preventive, preventing it rather than waiting for the actual episode to occur?
We've had similar situations to the example you just provided, and they're difficult because when we do follow up on a, what we call a Child Protective Services referral, essentially that is when they receive information from a child or a referrer that says that this kid has experienced or witnessed domestic violence in the home, then we'll go out and we'll do a welfare check. And we'll try to find out, hey, is this going on? This is what's been said, but a lot of times we don't get cooperation.
And then you have to deal with the episode or the incident.
Right. Well, there's essentially, if there are no marks or there's no specific information of something happening pretty much that day, then there's little that we can do, especially if we're not getting any cooperation.
Right.
And when I say cooperation, I mean a victim of domestic violence not revealing that they are a victim of domestic violence.
And you made a very good point earlier on, and I want our audience obviously to think about this, the viewing public. You don't need a warrant. If there is a domestic violence call and there's perceived that there is violence, that they can't hide behind this thing, well, where's your warrant? You can go into that home.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of people don't know that. So, obviously that serves a big value, obviously for you, because you have your hands and your options more available than waiting for some warrant to arrive. But there's another episode of this that I want to bring up to folks, and please correct me if I'm wrong, obviously I'm not a lawyer. But when you think of domestic violence, traditionally you think that it's man upon woman, and we know there's incidences of woman upon men. But a part of also domestic violence is if people are residing in that home, that could still be domestic violence. So in other words, correct me if I'm wrong, if they had like a friend and his girlfriend living in there, and all of a sudden there was an episode of violence there, they can also be charged with domestic violence if they reside in the home.
Absolutely.
Is that true here in Washington?
Yes.
Well, could you explain that definition? Because a lot of those folks, I had a patient of mine, and that's why I'm asking you the question, Brian. I had a patient of mine say, well, I didn't do anything. I just sit on the couch, and all of a sudden they arrested me. And I didn't have anything. Well, people that are living in that house, not visiting, living in that house, the rules apply to everyone,
Right.
correct?
The state law, the Revised Code of Washington, talks about has a definition for family or household members, and that refers to spouses, former spouses, any blood or related by marriage, relationships, even roommates. If they're roommates, and also persons 16 years or older with a dating relationship.
Okay. The last part of the episode, and then we'll take a quick break. Generally, sometimes by the time you get there, and we have a very rural county here in Calhoun County, and you, of course, supplemented with the city police force if it's in the city limits, it takes a while to get out there, even if you're cruising out in that area, because we've got a huge county. If you come upon a scene where, let's say, the perpetrator has fled the scene, and then you've got the situation where you've got the victim sitting there in the home bleeding like crazy, how do you manage that as far as sheriff assets? Because you said that generally you try to get in there with 2 sheriff's units. I assume that they're manned by 1 deputy, or is there 2 deputies in a car, or how does that work?
Well, we wait for our backup,
Okay.
especially on dangerous calls like this. So there would be 2 at a minimum.
Okay.
Even if the suspect has fled, because we don't know if they're going to return, where
Right.
they're at, in proximity to the scene or to the house. But essentially, the example that you provided, we would investigate that like anything else. We'd interview the victim, we would photograph injuries, the scene inside the house, and we get statements from any witnesses, just like anything else. And if we had sufficient probable cause to believe that she was a victim of an assault, we would issue what is called probable cause for the offender's arrest.
Okay.
And we would try very diligently to locate that person and arrest them for that.
Now, there's obviously, and I'm not trying to get you to be, modest about this, but feel free if you want to be. To become a detective is not an easy thing. You have your patrolmen, you have your rookies, you have the hierarchy going up the ladder. Since most of these items or episodes would be approached by a sheriff's deputy on patrol, their set of skills may be slightly different than the detective. So when do they call in the detective? Is that after the initial investigation's been done? Or if you happen to be on call, would you show up automatically? How exactly is that handled? So when the baton is passed, the investigation keeps going forward, because obviously the goal is to protect the children and the victim.
Right. Well, we patrol. Deputies respond to a lot of domestic violence calls. Me in my current position as a detective, most of the calls I handle are only felonies.
Okay.
So if it gets to if it's a felonious assault, then they would call me. But the competency of our patrol deputies is outstanding when it comes to domestic violence. Everyone is aware of the protocol that we follow, how important it is, and I would say if there was ever a felonious assault that they felt they needed assistance from detectives,
Right.
It would be a very smooth transition, because it's really just a basic process of separating suspect and victim and witnesses, interviewing them, documenting the scene, whether that be photographs, video walkthrough, what have you, and then determining, what kind of crime they have, if anything, and if it becomes, that it is a felonious, i.e., a deadly weapon was used in the assault. Obviously, we would be called. We would be looking at applying for search warrants and so on, so that we can make sure and document that crime scene or process that crime scene to build a case up against the suspect.
Obviously, one of the problems we face in today's society are people have perceptions of police officers. And they could be positive, they could be negative, and I always talk about it in a real frank sense that when they need you, you're the best friend they ever had.
Right.
But in today's case of perceptions of law enforcement officers and people having their own personal media, where they can take their cell phone and record everything. And we've seen many examples of that, especially in cases involving police officers and protesters. How do you handle that? How do you handle both of those factors, which 10, 15 years ago wasn't even a factor perhaps?
Right. I think what's happening on a national scale with law enforcement and so on, and how the media is portraying law enforcement on the national level, it's unfortunate. But how that is affecting our efforts in Clallam County, I don't think it has any effect at all. And you know, there have been situations where, not necessarily domestic violence situations, but like sovereign citizens who have held out their phone to videotape us while we're trying to enforce a law. And we just do our job like any other day. Might watch a little bit our language, but
Right.
But other than that, we're just doing our job.
Right. Well, a brief follow-up to that, and then we'll go ahead and take our break. I'm an old guy. I'm 62 years old. And I can remember growing up as a kid that if the law enforcement officers came in and busted up a party and said, hey, everybody freeze, whatever, we all sat down and behaved ourselves.
Right.
I notice a tendency now, and I think it talks about respect of a law enforcement officer, that if anything, they seem to show no respect, especially if they're intoxicated or have substance issues. So the days of you just saying, identifying yourself as a law enforcement officer and assuming someone's just going to sit down or show their hands, is it fair to say that even in a rural county like we have now, that those days are gone?
Probably. I mean, I didn't. I suppose the way when I grew up, it was the same way. But that was the way that I was taught. That was the culture of my family. You know, you respect authority. This is my personal belief. Is that you know, I'm not going to be able to solve all the world's problems, but I can use this platform, so to speak, as a law enforcement officer, that every contact with a citizen that I make, that I have a positive influence on their life in some way, shape, or form. Even if that means taking someone to jail, whether that be just talking to them about the core of who they are and what the problems that they're going through, and really listening to what they're going through. You know, I'm not going to be able to solve all the world's problems, but I do believe that each individual that I have contact with, and I have a positive influence in their life in some way, shape, or form, even if it's so small, that is going to make a difference in the long run.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to talk about the aftermath. We're going to talk about maybe some prevention that we can use so it doesn't blow up into an incident or an episode. And if Brian will be kind enough to answer the question, we're going to talk about the life of being a law enforcement officer. A lot of folks maybe don't understand the stresses and pressures that come to a law enforcement officer, but it doesn't necessarily end with their duties. Sometimes they bring it home. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our discussion about domestic violence. I found as a psychologist in the 28 years I've practiced, there's certain subjects people don't like talking about. And unfortunately, domestic violence ends up being one of those subjects. And I think if folks would realize how not only the violence involved, but how it impacts children, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is a big deal. This is something that does need to be discussed. And so I want to move into the next segment here, and we'll talk a little bit about the example of post-incident and what's required, the court process and the whole works. And then the important part to me, which is prevention, and how perhaps we can nip these before they become full-blown incidents, when then we're trying to clean up the damage. So let's talk about the post-incident. At this point, a person's been arrested, maybe both of them, who knows. They're going through the legal process. It's been submitted for prosecution. If the attorneys or the prosecuting attorney, whatever, decides to prosecute it, then you end up in the courtroom. Right. Where does the law enforcement officer come in to that process? And also, if there's kids involved, that has another niche, because then you get Child Protective Services. Where do you find yourself when now everybody's been put away and now the legal process begins?
Well, let me back up just to if we're at the scene of a domestic violence and we have made an arrest of the primary aggressor, who we deem to be the primary aggressor in the assault, then when we talk to the victim, we provide them a domestic violence pamphlet, which explains what domestic violence is, how does it happen, why does it happen, and on the back of the 2-page front and back DV pamphlet form is a list of local resources. And we urge them at that point to contact some of these local resources, whether it be shelters or Healthy Families is a great resource for victims of domestic violence. And we talk to them about the process of this person, your husband, boyfriend, is going to appear before a judge tomorrow, and it's going to be up to the attorneys whether or not they feel like this is a solid crime, and they're going to charge him with it. So there's a chance that they may not charge him, and so we urge them to go on to get a hold of Healthy Families. They have a representative there that can assist them with getting a domestic violence protection order that prohibits the other party from being in contact with them, and it's an important part of the process. And we explain to them that the court system, justice may not be served, so go on your own, or with the use of Healthy Families or representative from there, get that order so that you have one to protect you. Now, if the suspect who's been arrested is charged, typically the courts will issue an order automatically from the courts, from the state of Washington, to protect the victim. And the typical order would say that they're refrained from coming within the residence, so many feet of the residence. They're prevented from having any contact whatsoever, whether in person, by a third party, through mail, except for through a lawyer. And if there are any children, sometimes that's added on there as well.
Once that step's completed, and you've done all this, and you've been the brochures, and it's going to court, and let's assume this does escalate to where there's actual court hearing and things. What do you do as a detective, or what would you do as a law enforcement officer? You basically could testify to the conditions that you came upon. You can testify, imagine a police report or something's been written. But really, other than the judgment call, you make an arrest to enforce the laws of the land. What else can you do at that point?
Well, it depends on the situation. If a lot of time, well, there are times when bruises or physical injuries are not that apparent at the time that we're investigating the incident. So sometimes doing follow-up investigation by going out and taking additional photographs or follow-up photographs, sometimes bruising will appear a day or two after.
Okay.
So sometimes we'll do some follow-up to make that case stronger. But outside of that, if we don't have a good enough criminal case, there's really nothing that we can do.
Okay. Prevention.
Okay.
When we talk about prevention, in a sense, it's a two-edged sword. We can have the prevention of making sure that women and men know their rights, understand the impact of being convicted of domestic violence, whether it be a misdemeanor or a felony, the impact upon the children, and the fact that if both parties were involved, it could risk them losing their children. Protective services could come in and remove the children. There's a lot to lose here. And then on top of that, you could even throw the financial angle in, much like when we do our program on substance abuse. There is a cost for that. But we'll talk about that in another show. But here you are as a law enforcement officer, you've done your reports, the attorneys involved decide to prosecute. It's been a judge's hearing, the hearing's been held, and this person's found guilty. They go to jail for whatever the period of time is, and I know you're not the judge, so I won't go into that because of course it varies. And lo and behold, you get that phone call again. And it's the same couple, the same resident, and here we go again. Doesn't it kind of affect you in the back of your mind that do they get the message here, or is there something I can do to help this victim again as far as preventing these things to occur? Where exactly do you play into the second visit on these? Because they tend to multiply. It's not, every once in a while you'll get just an initial one and they learn their lesson, but I'm talking about the multiple instances. Right. How do you handle that?
Well, and that's not uncommon, and it's unfortunate. However, that is when we start bringing up, if they do have children, we'll talk about, okay, this has been happening, there's been a pattern of this happening, the abuse, and I've offered you resources, and it doesn't appear that you're going out of your way to use these resources, it's getting to the point where Child Protective Services will be involved, and they will eventually, if this continues, have to remove your children. And that's usually a wake-up call.
That should get their attention.
People. Absolutely. So, yeah.
Let's talk about detective, and I use that term because it's a term of respect. But Brian, as a detective, you deal with these areas, you investigate, you pull some street patrols and all that. But how about Brian the man? How exactly do you react to all this violence and seeing maybe the seedy side of life? Because I'm sure you're aware that some of the highest suicide rates are not only law enforcement officers, but also psychologists and psychiatrists.
Right.
Some of the violence, seeing so much violence, that could transfer. And I'm not saying this is your case, I'm just asking you some of the things you take in your life to make sure it doesn't happen. Multiple marriages. Mm-hmm. These things tend to run true, again, through the 28 years that I've seen. As a psychologist, it's easier for me because I'm not dealing with, per se, the violence you deal with as a detective, but it's venting, not bringing that home with me. Venting it, trying to find good things in life, making sure that if I discuss the issue with my wife, that I'm discussing it to be comforted more than anything else. How does a law enforcement officer deal with that?
Well, I think there's a few different ways that I personally deal with it. Talking with fellow law enforcement officers is a huge help. A lot of us, are going through the same thing, and so it's important to talk about these stressors that we have, as a result of our duties. But it's also having a good support system, and my wife is a great support system. She helps me when perhaps I'm down because of a certain investigation that I had. But also I think it's important to, in order to keep your mental health, healthy, your mind healthy, I should say, exercise. I think is a really good stress relief for me personally. So those three things.
Well, obviously we thank you for your service. I think that law enforcement officers are probably one of the least appreciated. I mean, when people deal with a fire department, your home's burning down, it's pretty easy to be very positive about that. But sometimes you meet people under the worst circumstances. Other times, most citizens may only have to worry about the lights being lit up behind them as they drive and figure out what the heck they did wrong. But it's a tough job. Sometimes there's not enough appreciation shown. But as I said to you when we talked earlier, one of the areas that all people agree in is when you need a law enforcement officer, they're all of a sudden your best friend.
Right.
And hopefully people will get to know law enforcement officers before it reaches a state of crisis. But I want to thank you for your service and thank you for appearing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You take care and God bless. Be safe. Thank you. When we return, we're going to talk a little bit about some solutions that I have in mind for those folks who are tuned in the program. And then we'll also be able to have your trivia question, which I think you'll find quite interesting. We'll be right back. Welcome back into Life's Journey with Dr. Ralph Smith. We want to extend our appreciation for all the time and effort and the wisdom of Detective Brian, and I hope that everybody paid attention to those segments because what he shared with us is front line of what he has to deal with. But let's deal with it in a clinic form. Domestic violence is obviously violent acts that are done upon people that live in the same residence. As the detective shared with us, it's not just a husband, wife, or committed relationship. It could be spousal abuse that is a committed relationship. It could be abuse where elderly abuse, which is one of the worst things to ever see, where an elderly parent may be staying in the home and the actual child or the kid involved with this as an adult kid could be doing violence in that. It could be violence kid upon kid. Domestic violence, it reaches across all those barriers. So here's the question. What can we do about it? Well, the first thing we need to do about it is recognize that it's a problem. A lot of times in my practice that I've had in the 28 years, I've actually had perpetrators come to me saying, Doc, I need some help. I get so angry, I just can't control myself, and all it takes is for my gal to say one word and I just go unloosed. And when I say go unloosed, that means where they're tied up together and just everything flies loose. Or going postal is another popular phrase. So what do? First of all, If you feel the need in a relationship, whether it be a domestic relationship or even a relationship at work or friends, where you cannot control your anger and temper, you have a problem that sooner or later will explode. You need to reach for help. There's a lot of different agencies that are available. There's a lot of therapists that are available. But admit that you have a problem and seek help, because there are effective tools to help you deal with anger management. And that's what this is all about. Second of all, if you have a relationship in your couples, whether it's a committed relationship or you're married or whatever the case might be, and you can't get along, that's a cry for help. Address it as a couples issue. Get the therapy or get the education you need to learn how to operate as a couple. Because a couple's relationship in a family is much like the foundation in a house. If you have a weak foundation and it fails, the whole house comes down. And it's the same thing about relationships. So if you find you cannot get along, then it's very important to get the help you need in couples counseling or couples therapy. The third piece, and to me, as a doctor, this is the most personal thing: children. We do a horrible job as a group, as a society, when we revert to violence, or especially domestic violence, and our children are observing that. In the state of Idaho, it's a felony to get involved with a domestic violence episode and have the children there in their presence. But you know what's worse than that felony? It's the role modeling. If you grow up in a family as a young man or a young lady and you observe violence, and I'm talking about domestic violence in a verbal sense, not only a physical sense and in a sexual sense, there's a lot of components to making domestic violence the serious problem it is. We're setting that as an example so that when our young men grow up or our young ladies grow up and this is what they've been exposed to, they believe that's the norm. And history will teach you that if you have a domestic violence issue with a mother that's been abused, it follows generation after generation after generation. So our job as a society is to break that chain and try to resolve problems before we have to involve law enforcement. And we stand ready to help you. And in our closing billboard, you'll see our numbers and our email addresses and websites so you can give us a call. Another important factor of this show, I want to know what you think. I want to know that these programs are working for you and that you can answer some basic questions. So consider this your homework, but here's the difference. We're going to have a trivia question on different subjects each and every Life's Journey show, and we're going to ask you to respond to our website or respond to our email address. And the one person that comes with the best answer is going to win a very special prize package. And who knows, we might even put you on television. You take care of one another, God bless, and please enjoy the happy life that you have been given. And if you've got problems, solve it early. Don't wait till the end.
If you or someone you know is a victim of domestic violence, I urge you to seek out resources to assist you, whether it be shelter, temporary housing placement, or contacting local resources such as Healthy Families that have advocates that are ready and waiting to assist victims of domestic violence, to assist them through the legal process, to receive, whether it be protection orders, to help prevent future acts of domestic violence. I urge you to follow up on these resources, to stand on your own 2 feet and be strong and utilize these resources so that we can stop this.